Now with the rafters, the first thing I'll do is look right down the top edge of the rafter and see where that natural crown is. And so like when I did my stud walls, I want to put that crown up or to the outside. Now once I figure out where the crown is on my board, I'm going to take it inside and actually lay it on top of the top plates and then get a handle on where my rafter cuts are going to be. This first rafter is going to be my template. It's what I'll use to cut all the other rafters with. And so once I get my template made, it's just a matter of transcribing the marks from this, the cuts from this rafter onto the other ones, and just cutting each one of them out individually. Now, if you're not a seasoned carpenter like I am not, I've got to really take my time on each step just to make sure I get it right. This would go fast for you, but for me, since I got to really take my time, I'm going to move a little slower, because each one of these cuts I make on this is going to mean the difference between a good rafter or a bad rafter. And so this first one I'm going to do is really crucial. I've got to really get this one right. And so I know my building is 8 foot from north to south. I'm wanting to put a 10-foot roof on it. We'll use 10 foot long tin on top of it. So I've got about a foot of overhang on each side, which ought to be plenty. And so the first thing I'm going to do is lay my rafter up here where it's going to sit, and then I'm just going to measure from the end plate up to about a foot and see where that gets me, so I can kind of get this rafter centered. Now I'm going to cut the end of these rafters off a little bit, and I'll tell you why here in a little while. But once I get that measured, then I can mark the width of my top plates, and I can go to the next step after that. Now I suppose I could go ahead, instead of cutting this bird's mouth out, and just use hurricane straps to tie these rafters to the top plate, but I kind of like the idea of being able to cut these bird's mouth out. I think this connection point will be stronger if you got it set down in there good. And so I'm going to go ahead and mark the front one, I'm going to mark the back one, and then take the wood down and then start the process of cutting out the bird's mouth. But once we get all this marked, there's still another consideration that we have to take into account. Okay, so we've got the location of the top plate on the front of the rafter and the back of the rafter marked, and right now I'm just marking the location which this rafter is going to run. So I put an S for south and then pointed this way. And so the next consideration I've got to figure out is, I don't know the pitch of this roof. So what I've got to do is do a little bit of math. So to figure out the pitch, I'm going to measure the height of the top plate, I'm going to measure the height of the bottom plate, and then do some math and figure it from there. Now, the reason I don't know the pitch of this roof is because if you're working off of plans, it'll obviously tell you what the pitch is. I'm not working off of plans on this, and I'm just kind of building as I go. And so I know the front wall is 97.5 inches. I've already measured that, and I don't have the measurement on the back wall yet, but once I get that, I'll be able to use some math. It's the Pythagorean theorem if you want to go that far, or you can make it simple and use a online calculator to calculate roof pitch. Okay, so this is the part I really have to slow down and pay attention, and that's marking these rafters, because again, I don't do this all the time, and I'm a little bit slow at it, but I want to be methodical so that way I don't mess up any of this wood that I brought home with me. So the first thing I did, once I determined what the pitch of the roof was, I cut me a little cheater board. And what this board is for is I laid it up there in the correct orientation and then marked which way was south. And so that way I can have this board handy, and when I'm marking these rafters, I know that I've got my bird's mouth oriented properly. Now, another thing I want to make sure I do is I've already marked the top of the board here, and make sure I keep the board up top. I'm going to put the bird's mouth on the bottom of the board and make sure we keep it all oriented properly all the time. So if you noticed on my sample board, we've got a couple of cuts that we make. We've got a square cut that is this one, that's perpendicular to the bottom of the board, and then we've got our bird's mouth cut, which is the one that's at the angle, or this is the same slope as the pitch of our roof. And because our roof doesn't have a lot of pitch, this is relatively a shallow cut. So I tried to cut the first one I cut with the circular saw. I think from this point forward I'll just use a jigsaw. I think it'll cut out easier. But this is what the angle of our roof. I laid it up there again. You can see my S and then the arrow pointing south. I know that this rafter is going to run this way, and so that's my cheater board I'm going to do. So that's my cheater board that I'll use. Now if we come back to our rafter, you'll notice here we've got a couple of marks that we made after we laid the rafter up on the top plates and marked where the top plates are. So that's 3.5 inches wide, and we we can prove that by using our speed square here. So that's 3.5 inches wide that top plate, that this rafter will sit on the top plate. So if I look at my guide here, I notice that the one on the left is my square cut. So I will go ahead and line up my speed square there and make that mark across the rafter. So I went ahead and marked where the width of the plate is, and if I take a piece of scrap lumber here, you can see it's the exact width of a 2x4. So knowing that, we know this cut towards the north end of our board is going to be parallel, so our angled cut's going to be here. And I just made these just for reference on the first one so I can show you. The next cut I'll make, I won't have this line here on the south side will be angled. So using my speed square, I know I got to draw in the pitch of the roof, and so we put our pivot point at our mark right here that we made earlier, and then we just keep that tucked in there and pivot it. Now if you'll notice on these speed squares, it says common right here, and so these are the common rafter pitches you're going to run into: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And so now we know that our pitch is just a little over 1, almost 1 1/8 pitch. It doesn't have 1 1/8 measured there, but I'm just going to estimate, and once I get that measurement in, I'll just go ahead and mark it across there. So to keep from confusing myself, I'll mark that one out, and so we know now we have a perpendicular line on our rafter, and now we have an angled line, and that represents the pitch. Now I've got to make a straight edge, and I could use my speed square, but it's a little easier to use a framing square here. And so then all I'll do is line up the framing square on that pitch mark I made, and then run it up the pitch mark until I can see this line on my perpendicular cut, and then I can mark it. And now we know that this part of the wood right here, that's our bird's mouth, and that's where we'll have to cut out. Now I need to note, when we're cutting, we're going to cut on the outside of this line, and that will make our bird's mouth a lot more accurate instead of cutting right on the line or cutting on the inside of the line, because you got to remember the width of the saw blade is about 1/8 of an inch. So if we cut here, we're not going to cut enough off, so we're going to cut with the saw blade on the outside of the line, and that way we make sure we get plenty cut away from there. So now we got the first bird's mouth mark. We'll just repeat the process at our other marks on the other end of the board. Okay, again, cutting these rafters is going to be a process for me. So I've got the north bird's mouth marked, I've got the south bird's mouth marked. Again, to keep my marks correct, I use my handy template that I cut earlier. And now I've got to cut the front and back end of the rafter just to make sure that we've got those plumb cuts. I think it'll look better with the plumb cut than it would with the rafters just sticking up in there. Now if I was going to leave these rafters untrimmed, I probably would just let them stick up in the air without them cut, but I'm going to trim them, and I want that fascia board to be flat with the rest of the building, so I'm going to have to cut the same pitch into the end of the rafters. So where I really got to slow down and pay attention on these rafters and making these cuts is, even though the rafters are 10 feet long and my tent is 10 feet long, I got to cut these rafters a little bit shorter. And the reason why is I'm going to have a fascia board on the front, a rough board on the front to tie all the rafters together, and then I'm going to have a fascia board on top of that. So whatever I cut, I need to take into account the thickness of these two pieces. So to make myself a template, I just put a piece of the siding and the soffit material I'll use, as well as a 2x6 that I'm going to put across the front to tie all the rafters together in the end. Now that also doesn't take into account for the 1/2 inch or the inch I want the tin to overhang, and so I've got to mark where these are going to be, and then go back another inch and mark the final location of these. Then I can mark the proper location of my plumb cut with my speed square. Now with my rafters cut, I lined each rafter up along the front where they're even with each other, and then that way they're even on the back, and I use these bar clamps to clamp them all together. Now this is really the last step of my rafter prep. One of the things I went ahead and did after I got them all clamped together is I checked my bird's mouth underneath. They all line up, so we're in good shape there. Everything's going to sit on top of the top plates well. But the reason I put all the boards together and clamp them, because the last step is I need to cut out the channels where the purlins are going to sit. And to do that, I just marked the location of where the purlins are going to lie, and then I'll use a square to mark a square board across all these boards. And then after that, I'll mark the width of them, just using a piece of 2x4 for scraps, because that's what my purlins are going to be. And then the last step is I just need to set the saw, cut a bunch of grooves across this, and then I can knock out the excess and chisel it out a little bit, and then I'll have a good, nice flat spot for these purlins to sit. Okay, so now once I've cut these grooves across these boards, I can then just take my hammer and just start knocking these pieces out. It only takes a minute or two, but once you get the insides cleaned out, you can see I've got a pretty good base, but we've still got some pieces kind of sticking up. And to fix that, we can run our claw through and knock a few more down, but ultimately we're going to get a chisel and then chisel out this groove, and that'll give us a good flat spot for our purlins to set. So really the point of this chiseling is not to gouge out the wood. You want to try to keep the chisel really flat to the wood surface, and all we're trying to do is just knock out these high spots. And one of the things on these chisels, you got to be careful with them because they are sharp. And if you have a couple little high spots left over, probably not going to hurt too much. We'll just try to do the best we can. Doesn't have to be perfectly like floor smooth, but you want to get it close. And one thing you can do is, if you've got a spot that's not very big, you just hit it with the hammer, and that'll help knock it down as well. But once we've got all the pieces chiseled out, we can try our piece of wood in there. And I cut a little bit sloppy, but it sits down in there well. So I'm back on the ladder again. All the rafters are cut, the bird's mouth cut, the angle cut on the front and back of the rafter tails are cut, the grooves for the purlins are cut. They're ready to go. But now I've got to get back up here on my top plates and mark the where each rafter is going to lay. Now, if you remember on an earlier video, when I marked for the stud location, I put the studs on 16-inch centers, but I actually put the mark at 16 3/4, so that way I could line the edge of the board up with that mark, and then they'd still be on the 16-inch centers. Well, we're going to use that same concept today, except these rafters are going to go on 24-inch centers. So from the end of this top plate, I'm going to measure down 24 inches, go an extra 3/4, so 24 3/4. Make a mark, draw it across with my speed square, put an X on the side where the board needs to lay. I'll do it on the top plate here on the north side of the building. I'll do it on the top plate on the south side of the building, and that'll give us the reference marks that we can get our rafters up here and start laying our rafters out. Okay, so I've got my rafters laid up here, and I've also got my marks made, and you can see there I did just like I did on the bottom and top joists. And so now all I'm going to do is slide these rafters into place. They ought to just notch right in there nicely, get them lined up good on each one of the lines, and just put a nail in for each one. I'm going to come back later and put some put some hurricane straps on here. So right now all I need to do is tack them in place with 1 or 2 nails on each end, and away I go.